Zoe Morris never planned on becoming the kind of person who had to defend her land with legal documents and county surveys, but life, especially in small-town neighborhoods with inflated egos and an obsession with control, rarely follows anyone's plans. Her property sat on the edge of what used to be open rural land. Just gravel, brush, and the occasional delivery truck that wandered too far off the highway. Her father had bought the land back when most of the town still thought the outskirts were useless. Too far from the schools, too far from the new supermarkets, and certainly too far from whatever version of community the developers thought they were building. That distance suited him. And now, after he passed, it suited Zoe even more. The land was large, oddly shaped, and cut in a way that wrapped around what would later become a fancy gated neighborhood. A place with tastefully identical mailboxes and quarterly newsletters filled with passive-aggressive notes about trash bins and leaf blowers. Zoe's house, a 2-story farmhouse converted into a combination home and workshop, sat at the top of a gentle slope, its long curved driveway cutting through a strip of land that most people assumed belonged to the gated community. But it didn't. Not by a long shot. That gravel road was hers. Purchased, documented, taxed, and maintained with her own 2 hands and money. And right across that road, about 100 feet down from her front porch, stood a pair of sleek black iron gates. The proud, mechanical entrance to what the residents beyond it believed was their private world. Zoe didn't pay them much attention. She never had. Her work, refurbishing and selling second-hand tools and mechanical equipment, kept her too busy to care about neighborhood politics or whose grass was half an inch too long. She didn't even mind when the HOA, or whatever smug acronym the neighborhood board had adopted, started installing more cameras, adding motion lights, and repainting the gates. As long as they stayed out of her way and didn't try to dictate what she did on her land, she was content to keep her mouth shut and her head down. That changed one morning in early spring, when she walked down to her mailbox and found a laminated notice zip-tied to the old wooden post. Access to this entrance road is subject to community review and control, effective immediately. At first, she thought it was a prank, or maybe something sent to the wrong address. But the notice had her name printed in block letters at the bottom, alongside a logo she'd seen before on envelopes from the neighborhood's board. What followed over the next 48 hours would shift her life from a quiet routine of repair work and invoices into a grinding, adversarial standoff, one built on lies, manipulation, and the kind of passive tyranny only suburban bureaucracy could master. It started with a call. A man named Brett, who introduced himself as a community access coordinator, informed her in the most condescending tone imaginable that recent updates to the jurisdictional map had created a situation in which her driveway, which had served as a neutral path for years, now fell under joint consideration for management. Zoe asked for clarification, but all she got were vague phrases about easements and community safety. When she pushed, Brett let something slip. It's really just formalizing what everyone already assumes, that the gates and the road leading to them are part of the neighborhood's access system. Zoe felt the blood rise in her face. "They're not," she said. "That road is mine. You should know that if you've looked at any actual maps." "Oh," Brett said with a dry chuckle, "we've looked at plenty of maps." That was the first moment she understood something deeper was happening. This wasn't about paperwork, it was about power. That road was a quiet little loophole, a perfect lever for someone like Brett and whatever smug retirees sat behind him to try and turn into leverage. Maybe they thought she'd cave, that she'd sell them a strip of land or grant an easement just to keep the peace, but that wasn't going to happen. The next week, things escalated. Metal signs appeared overnight along the length of her driveway. "Private property, HOA members only," bolted into the ground with ugly, rust-resistant screws. Someone had poured gravel over the wheel ruts to make the road look more like theirs. The automated gate, which previously swung open at the presence of any vehicle, now required an RFID pass, something Zoe most definitely did not have. She drove through it anyway, and the gate jerked open after a delay, as if controlled manually from inside one of the nearby homes. Then came the emails, friendly but firm reminders that, due to her status as a non-member, her access would be limited to specific hours. Hours, on her own damn land. Zoe wasn't one to explode in rage. She'd been raised to handle nonsense with precision, not theatrics. So she did what made sense. She contacted her land use attorney, a bulldog of a woman named Monica, who'd once threatened to file a restraining order against a city planner just for rolling his eyes. Monica was practical, calm, and terrifying in the way that only deeply competent people can be. "They're playing dumb, which usually means they're playing dirty," she said after reviewing Zoe's deed, topographic records, and survey history. "Let's give them just enough rope to hang themselves." The first letter Monica sent was civil. A basic reminder that the property line hadn't changed and that any attempt to obstruct or restrict Zoe's legal access to her home would constitute trespass and harassment. A week passed with no response. Then came a registered letter from the HOA, wrapped in the same over-designed formatting as their holiday invitations, filled with artificial warmth and legal landmines. They requested Zoe attend a board hearing to discuss mutual usage boundaries and maintenance expectations. Monica laughed when she read it. "They think they're a court now?" But Zoe, always methodical, decided to attend, not out of respect, but out of strategy. She walked into that community center in steel-toed boots and a denim work shirt, standing out among the pastel blazers and polo shirts like a bulldozer in a flower bed. The board sat behind a long table, a poorly lit nameplate in front of each of them, and none of them could look her in the eye when she calmly read from her deed aloud, citing lot numbers, coordinates, and the specific year the land had been registered, 32 years before their precious neighborhood even existed. One woman, a large, sour-faced woman named Karen, interrupted with a huff. "But common access rules override that, don't they?" "No," Zoe replied, deadpan. "That's not how property law works. You should really stop Googling legal advice." By the end of the meeting, Zoe hadn't raised her voice once, but they knew she wasn't bluffing. Unfortunately, that didn't mean they'd stop. That's not how people like Karen or Brett operated. They didn't attack head-on. They chipped away. They made you feel like you were the one causing the problem, and they'd just begun their campaign. Over the next month, small inconveniences began piling up. Her deliveries were delayed. A contractor refused to pour a new concrete base for her tool racks, saying he couldn't access the site reliably. Her power flickered randomly, even though there were no outages nearby. One night, she found a set of deep scratches across the side of her work truck. The next morning, her mailbox was filled with printouts of zoning violations, none of them hers. Zoe knew better than to retaliate. She documented everything. Every phone call. Every suspicious incident. Every change to the gate. She began to suspect they were hoping to provoke her into doing something they could legally use against her. But she wouldn't give them that. What they didn't realize yet, what they never expected, was that she had more patience, more planning, and more sheer resilience than any board full of paper tyrants could imagine. Because if they wanted a war over a driveway, Zoe Morris was ready to fight it, and they had no idea how badly they'd miscalculated where that battle would be fought. The first real punch didn't come from a letter or a smug comment. It came from concrete, 10 inches thick, poured directly across the mouth of Zoe's driveway like a slap in the face. She found it early one morning when she drove down in her truck, heading out to pick up salvaged engine parts. Overnight, without notice, someone had installed a pair of concrete traffic dividers right at the junction where her gravel road curved toward the gate. The barriers weren't random. They were placed just so, enough to make turning impossible without scraping the truck, angled in a way that implied ownership and exclusion. No signs, no warning, just presence. She stepped out, stared at them in disbelief, and crouched to inspect the base. Still damp at the edges, with traces of wheelbarrow ruts in the soft earth nearby. Someone had worked through the night, right under the security cameras mounted at the gate, and no one said a word. She drove around through the back trail that looped behind her property, barely more than a fire road, and arrived late to the parts depot, where she had to explain to the warehouse foreman that she might need a few days to get her usual transport. Route cleared. He looked at her with that half-smile that said he'd heard worse. "Just cut through the gate," he said. "You're a local." That was the problem. She was too local, too permanent, too immovable for their comfort. Back home, she started with city code enforcement. Not because she expected immediate help, but because the paper trail mattered. She logged the obstruction as an illegal encroachment, citing her parcel number and property use classification. They told her someone would investigate within 5 to 10 business days. Useless. So she called Monica, her attorney, who listened silently before responding with a sharp, "They're escalating. We're filing an injunction." But before that injunction could be filed, Zoe received a visit. Not from the police, not from code enforcement, but from a man in a county utilities truck, clipboard in hand and sunglasses too reflective to see his eyes. "We got a report of illegal utility tie-ins," he said without greeting. "Gonna need to inspect your access panel." She stared at him, jaw clenched, and then gestured wordlessly toward the breaker box attached to the side of her workshop. He took photos, scribbled a few notes, and left without further explanation. That evening, her power flickered again. This time, it didn't come back on. She spent the night under candlelight, trying not to jump at every sound outside. Her dogs growled intermittently from the back porch. At one point, she heard a vehicle idle near the gate and then drive off slowly. She didn't sleep. At sunrise, she was on the phone with her electrician. They checked the power feed. Nothing inside the house or on her end was wrong. But the junction box, the one sitting conveniently near the gated road, had been tampered with. Clean cuts, professionally done. Nothing stolen, nothing damaged beyond restoration. Just disabled. It wasn't enough to block her access. Now they wanted to cut her off entirely, drive her out like a thorn in the skin. Monica returned with a drafted cease and desist, filed it the same day, and delivered copies to the community board's official mailing address. That same evening, Zoe received a second letter from the board, this time written in a tone that tried to sound wounded, even concerned. They apologized for any misunderstandings regarding the concrete dividers, explained them as temporary deterrents against vandalism, and claimed they were removed within 24 hours of installation. That was a lie. Zoe had already photographed and dated the dividers that morning, still very much present, still hard as stone, still blocking her way. She emailed the photos to Monica, who responded with one word: beautiful. But what really sent the message that this wasn't a negotiation anymore came 3 days later, when Zoe's insurance provider called. Someone had submitted a claim indicating there had been multiple documented complaints of unsafe conditions on her property, unsecured tools, dangerous equipment storage, and unattended minors near industrial hardware. The representative was courteous, almost apologetic, but firm. They were required to investigate. Zoe had never even had an accident on record. She didn't let anyone near her equipment who wasn't authorized. She didn't even have children on the premises. It was pure fiction. She asked who submitted the claim, but the rep couldn't say, "Anonymous reporting through our risk portal." That same night, a fire inspection notice appeared on her door. No one had knocked. No one had called. The notice had the same subtle language. Recent observations suggest non-compliance with local safety ordinances. At that point, Zoe knew she wasn't just being harassed. She was being softened. Someone thought if they layered enough pressure, utilities, insurance, infrastructure, they could wear her down before any court date came around. But they hadn't done their homework. Zoe didn't scare easy, and she didn't quit. She doubled her documentation efforts, backed up her footage, printed her emails. She kept her truck parked near the gate at all times now, a reminder that she was still there, still watching. And when Monica got confirmation that the emergency injunction had been granted, she had the papers posted publicly, on the gate itself. That night, someone removed the documents from the gate and left them torn in pieces under Zoe's truck windshield. By morning, the concrete dividers had been painted over, white lines to mimic pedestrian markers as if to disguise their real function. Zoe didn't bother repainting or arguing. She simply called the county road division, filed a formal interference report, and scheduled a site review. But she didn't wait around for a result. She began preparing a counteroffensive, not with threats or slogans, but with leverage. She compiled a list of vendors, deliveries, and public services that required access through her property. Trash collection, water testing, broadband installation, all things the HOA relied on for their prestige, and she contacted each of them, one by one, calmly, directly. You may want to check the easement and access rights before scheduling future service, she said. There's a boundary dispute at the moment. The messages didn't go unnoticed. Within 72 hours, trucks started rerouting. Pickups were missed, appointments rescheduled, and slowly the gated neighborhood's own residents started noticing. Their services weren't just delayed, they were being warned. And unlike Zoe, they weren't used to disruptions. The power play had begun to boomerang, but Zoe knew it wouldn't stop them. Not yet. People like Brett, like Karen, like all the other self-important nobodies in pressed khakis and sun hats, they didn't know how to walk back quietly. They'd push until something broke. She just had to make sure it wasn't her. There was a rhythm to the intimidation now, a slow, deliberate beat that pulsed through every part of Zoe's day. She no longer assumed anything was neutral. Every noise near the gate, every unfamiliar car idling too long at the corner of her field of vision, every notice slipped into her mailbox carried a weight to it. It wasn't paranoia. Not when she had physical evidence, not when she had timestamps, photos, records. This was real. And now it wasn't just inconvenience or spiteful obstruction. It had evolved into something more organized, more calculated, as if someone had mapped out a long-term campaign to bleed her out, of energy, money, credibility, and, above all, time. The first hit came early on a Monday morning, a day that should have started with her welding the new tool racks she'd designed the night before. Instead, she woke to find her front gate half torn from its post, hanging at an awkward angle like a dislocated shoulder. The lock was snapped clean through, the metal twisted unnaturally, too thick to have been damaged by hand or even by ordinary tools. She stood staring at it for several long seconds, one hand still holding her coffee mug, the other clenched at her side. The dogs had barked the night before, she remembered, but she hadn't gone out. Maybe she should have. Maybe that was the point. Whoever did this had taken their time. There were no signs of theft. Nothing stolen. Just the gate, broken, left there like a symbol. She didn't call the police. Not yet. She knew how those calls went. A deputy would show up late, take a couple of photos, scribble half-hearted notes, and ask her if she had any idea who might have done it. No, she'd call her fabricator instead. The new gate would be reinforced, welded directly into a deeper post, and fitted with a locking bar she designed herself. Let them try again. This time, they'd need more than just bolt cutters or brute force. 2 days later, a delivery truck rolled up to her drive, only to pause at the gate. The driver, a young guy with nervous eyes and an apologetic smile, refused to enter the property, saying his GPS route had been updated and now flagged her address as restricted commercial access. She stepped outside, asked to see the notification. It was real. His system showed a yellow tag on her parcel. Gate-controlled entry point. Private community approval required. She thanked him, accepted the pallet at the roadside, and carried it up the drive herself, one load at a time in the full heat of the afternoon. Then she called the logistics provider. They transferred her 3 times before she reached someone who admitted that the update had been submitted from the community end. When she asked for a name, the line went silent. Then the call disconnected. Zoe didn't scream or throw anything. She returned to her desk, opened a spreadsheet she hadn't touched in months, and began logging every interaction. Date, time, source, consequence. Every disruption now had a line, a column, a case number she assigned. She would not let this become a blur of frustration. She would not let them scatter her focus. This was how they won. By chaos. Her answer would be order. The next escalation came through her business. Her website, simple, practical, nothing flashy, began receiving a series of negative reviews from users she couldn't trace. The usernames were gibberish strings, the comments vague and identical, warning others of unprofessional service and dangerous workspaces. She submitted requests for removal, sent counter-evidence, but even the customer service platform gave her the same response. All reports must be evaluated in sequence. Response time estimated 14-21 business days. That same week, a zoning compliance officer arrived unannounced at her gate. This time it wasn't a utilities worker or some guy in a vest. This one had a badge, a clipboard, and a legal pad full of printed photos, some of them clearly taken from the upper floor windows across the gate. He claimed her latest workshop extension had been constructed without a valid permit. She showed him the papers, the stamped approval, the contractor invoice. He nodded, checked a box, then pulled out a second document. A formal notice of violation regarding unsanctioned use of residential property for commerce. This wasn't about the new shed. This was about the business itself. Zoe's shop wasn't fancy, but it was legal. Grandfathered in under her father's old zoning agreement and confirmed again 5 years prior. But that didn't matter now. Not when the goal wasn't prosecution, but pressure. She filed an appeal with Monica, who was now fielding calls daily from departments she hadn't spoken to in years. "This smells coordinated," Monica said bluntly. "They're not even hiding it anymore." That night, Zoe installed 2 more security lights, both with motion sensors and battery backups in case the power went again. She wasn't afraid. She was preparing. When someone tried to back a vehicle up the drive 2 nights later at 3:42 a.m., the light caught them full in the face. They turned around and left. She logged the make, the model, the partial plate, and called it in. Not to the police, but to a friend in the county records office, someone who still owed her a favor. "I'll see what I can do," he said. "But if this is what I think it is, you've poked the wrong hive." The final blow of that week came from an unexpected direction. Her accountant. He called with a strange tone in his voice, not quite alarmed, but definitely concerned. "We got flagged," he said. "An audit trigger popped up tied to one of your past returns. Nothing illegal, just unusual activity. But they're looking." Zoe paused. "Looking at what?" "Your assets, your land, your depreciation filings. Someone's digging." That was enough. She met Monica the next morning at the courthouse and signed a formal complaint for retaliatory harassment. But more than that, she requested a temporary protection order, not for herself, but for her property. The judge didn't laugh. He read the files, leafed through her compiled timeline, and nodded slowly. "They think they're wearing you down," he said, signing the request. "You're doing the opposite." By the time she returned home that day, 2 of the neighbors were already at the gate, standing outside it, unsure whether to knock, unsure what to say. They weren't hostile. If anything, they looked embarrassed. One of them finally spoke. "We didn't know they were going to take it this far," he muttered. "We thought it was just a formality, just getting things on paper." Zoe looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. "Nothing's just paper when it comes to land," she said. "You sign something once, and it becomes the truth forever." The man nodded, lowered his eyes. He didn't argue, and just like that, the ground began to shift. Not fast, not openly, but something had cracked. The HOA had counted on silence. Now, silence was crumbling. By the time the survey team showed up, Zoe had already been awake for 3 hours, pacing the edge of her driveway like a sentry. The air was heavy with the kind of heat that sat on your skin like grease, the kind of morning that promised the sun wouldn't be kind, and she stood there, arms folded, watching the county van ease up to the barricade at the bottom of the road. The 2 men inside were exactly what she expected. Tired eyes, khaki pants, utility belts loaded with instruments, and the thin, mechanical patience of professionals who had seen every kind of property dispute unfold in front of them. But these weren't private contractors. This time she'd gone through official channels, pulled strings through Monica's connections, filed a formal request, and got the County Land Services Department involved. This wasn't some favor. This was jurisdiction. They stepped out without any pleasantries, introduced themselves, and began unloading equipment. Zoe said little. She'd already staked flags along the points she knew were legally hers, pulled from the oldest deed she could find in her father's files, double-checked against digitized plat maps, and confirmed again through her own tape and compass work. She didn't need validation. She needed proof they couldn't ignore. The men worked quietly, occasionally muttering measurements to each other. One of them gestured toward the black gate and raised an eyebrow. "That structure's sitting well past your boundary line," he said. Zoe nodded. "That's what I thought." The second man took photos from 3 angles, then scribbled notes. They didn't give opinions. That wasn't their job. But when they finished, they gave her a copy of their preliminary findings. She didn't even have to read it to know what it said. The gate, installed, maintained, and guarded by the neighborhood board, was positioned almost 11 feet inside her land. Later that evening, Monica called her, voice taut with satisfaction. "That document is gold," she said. "It's clean, unambiguous. We submit it to the zoning board, and if the association pushes back, we make it public. You've got standing now, and more than that, you've got leverage." Zoe listened in silence, the paper resting on her kitchen table, her finger tracing the faint dotted property line that told the truth no one had wanted to hear. But it didn't stop there. The following day, a manila envelope arrived at her door, hand-delivered by courier, no return address. Inside, a single printed email thread, stripped of headers, detailing a conversation between the HOA president, Brett, and a consulting firm that specialized in community expansion strategies. The text was formal but revealing. Terms like quiet acquisition, value neutralization, and compliance framing jumped off the page. One line, in particular, burned into her memory. "If the owner resists, shift pressure to external channels. Permit review, contractor reclassification, utilities if available." Whoever had sent it wanted her to see it, and that meant someone inside their structure had doubts or fears. Zoe didn't run with it, didn't shout it from rooftops. She filed it away, scanned it, and handed the original to Monica. They both knew it wouldn't hold up in court without provenance, but it told them everything they needed to know. This wasn't incompetence, it wasn't confusion, it was design. Still, design didn't matter if it collapsed in the public light. So Zoe began taking small, quiet actions to shift perception. She invited the local fire marshal to inspect her property, unprompted. She walked him through every outbuilding, explained the placement of each flammable container, handed over her safety protocols and fire break documentation. He found nothing amiss and made a note of her cooperation. 2 days later, she hosted the same broadband contractor the HOA had used to install their gate cameras. She asked for an evaluation of her own security network, requesting full coverage along her property line. The technician laughed when he saw the gate. then muttered something under his breath about overreach gone corporate. Zoe didn't press him. She just paid the bill and kept the receipt. People were beginning to talk, not just at the board meetings where Karen's voice was reportedly growing louder and more shrill, but among the neighborhood residents themselves. Someone posted anonymously on a local forum, "Why does the board care more about squeezing one landowner than fixing the drainage that's been flooding Lot 27 for 2 years?" Another thread asked why deliveries were now delayed to half the homes near the back gate. No answers came, but the silence was loud. Then came the crack. One of the board members, an older man named Harris who rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary, resigned. No press release, no replacement announced, just a quiet departure. Monica called her 2 hours later. "That's a crack in the dam," she said. "They're starting to realize they can't win this one. You push too clean, too smart, too public. It's harder to spin a narrative when you've never lost your temper or sent a single threatening message." That night, Zoe walked to the end of her drive and stood under the glare of the newly installed motion light. The air was still. The gates remained closed, the cameras blinking red in their quiet rotations. Somewhere beyond them, in perfectly trimmed lawns and sterile white kitchens, people were deciding how to save face. She knew they wouldn't back off entirely. Not yet. Not without a final move, one that would test how far they could still reach. But for the first time since this began, Zoe wasn't just resisting. She was winning. Zoe had expected retaliation, but she underestimated how petty and simultaneously sophisticated the next move would be. It wasn't loud or flashy. It didn't arrive with construction crews or legal notices. It crept in through a series of quiet revisions, unnoticed by anyone who wasn't obsessive enough to scan every detail of local filings and planning documents. Fortunately for her, she had become exactly that obsessive. It was in the weekly update from the municipal zoning office that she spotted it. A proposed reclassification of the service corridor adjacent to her property from multi-access rural to restricted utility management zone. The language was intentionally vague, full of bureaucratic vagueness, but the consequences were obvious. The change, if passed, would strip her driveway of legal recognition as an independent access route and designate it instead as a managed asset overseen by community governance. In layman's terms, they were trying to erase her road off the map without ever stepping onto it. She brought the document to Monica, who read it twice and cursed under her breath. "They're leveraging a shell ordinance," she said. "It was drafted for outdated infrastructure projects years ago, but it was never repealed. It's like pulling a gun out of a museum and finding out it still fires." They had 3 days to respond before it went to committee. 3 days to build a legal objection that would stop it from advancing to the county council, where its passage would be a formality. Zoe didn't blink. She shifted everything in her schedule, canceled supply runs, and began compiling a complete history of the road: deeds, invoices, delivery manifests, maintenance contracts, repair logs. Monica filed for a public hearing, then submitted an emergency stay on the zoning revision. But that was only one front. On another, the board launched an aggressive internal campaign disguised as community cohesion. Flyers appeared on every doorstep behind the gate, written in an intentionally friendly tone but riddled with thinly veiled accusations. Concerns about unregulated border access, shared responsibility for neighborhood image, the importance of unified representation in legal matters. The implication was clear. Zoe wasn't just a problem. She was a threat to the harmony of the community. Several residents, confused and uneasy, called the board hotline asking if something dangerous was happening. They were told it was a pending matter of review and advised not to engage in speculation. Word spread quickly, rumors followed faster, and then Zoe's bank called. A hold had been placed on a transaction, one of her larger payments to a supplier, flagged by their compliance department for property ownership verification. The call was courteous but cold, the kind that made it clear the representative didn't fully understand what they were relaying, only that a red flag had been triggered by a third-party data integrity alert. Zoe asked who the third party was. The woman on the other end paused. "I'm sorry, that information isn't available at this level." Zoe hung up without saying thank you. That night she walked the property with a flashlight, scanning the perimeter. Something had changed. Not on the surface, but the air felt different. Thicker. Watchful. At the edge of the north fence line, she found it. An old-style trail camera hidden in the branches, aimed not at wildlife but directly at her secondary gate. She removed it without hesitation, inspected it in her workshop. It was generic, unmarked, using off-the-shelf components. She crushed it in a vise and threw the pieces into her scrap pile. The next morning, her trash collection didn't arrive. Not hers alone, but her section of the road. 6 houses total. She called the service provider, who told her that access issues had forced a reroute. She asked if that was reported by the HOA. The clerk hesitated, then said, "I can't say, just that a community officer submitted a logistics notice." Zoe called Monica. "They're trying to isolate the road, not just from legal status but from function. If no one uses it, they'll argue it's redundant. If it's redundant, they can phase it out. It's slow erasure." Zoe didn't panic. She countered. She offered a temporary easement to the collection service, filed publicly, granting them explicit access to her land for utility purposes. She registered the document with the county recorder, stamped and signed. If they wanted to cut her off, they'd have to argue against public service infrastructure, and that was a losing battle. But the board wasn't finished. Their next move was bolder. They hosted a community safety summit at the local high school, inviting residents from neighboring developments. Zoe wasn't formally excluded, she simply wasn't informed. She learned about it from a delivery driver who saw her name brought up during a Q&A. Someone, likely Karen, had raised a case study of a homeowner resisting shared governance and site modernization. No names were mentioned, but the location details were obvious. Video of the event surfaced later, and in it, Karen smiled serenely as she spoke about the need to protect our long-term investment from fragmentation. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was there. Zoe didn't respond with a press release or a blog post. Instead, she contacted the Public Land Access Registry and submitted a counter-petition for land use preservation. It was a rarely used mechanism, one her father had told her about once when discussing rural land rights. It allowed a private owner to claim permanent function status for roads older than 30 years if they met specific continuity conditions. Hers did. The process was slow, full of red tape, and depended heavily on documentation. Fortunately, Zoe had more documentation than anyone they'd ever tried to intimidate. As the petition was logged, she received another letter, this time from a law firm she didn't recognize. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a request for mediation. The firm represented concerned residents of the community association. They proposed a closed-door meeting to resolve long-standing boundary and access disputes amicably. Monica laughed when she read it. They want you in a room without witnesses. That's not mediation, that's containment. Zoe declined, politely. She sent a letter back, stating her willingness to participate in open hearings, moderated by an impartial third party, with full transcription and public record. No reply came, and then the final pressure drop landed like a thunderclap. Her property insurance was rescinded, not because of a claim or risk, because of policy incompatibility with zoning status. In other words, someone had fed the insurer the same language as the planning revision. Her address, her land use, had been marked as unstable. It was the dirtiest shot yet. Zoe didn't flinch. She called an independent agent, provided every document she had, and rewrote the policy through a rural commercial provider. It cost more. The coverage was tighter, but it was hers. Untouchable. Bulletproof. And when the county issued the hearing date for the zoning challenge, Zoe prepared her statement. No anger, no theatrics, just maps, dates, ownership chains, easement law, and her quiet, unwavering certainty. They thought they were cornering her. They were just building her case. The hearing room wasn't what Zoe expected. It wasn't a courtroom, just a bland municipal chamber with folding chairs, fluorescent lights, and a digital clock that blinked 5 minutes slow. But the tension inside could have rivaled a federal trial. She sat near the front, arms crossed loosely, folder resting on her lap. Monica sat beside her, a thick binder in front of her, filled with everything from tax maps to utility access receipts to photographs of the gate cast in morning shadow. Its steel posts firmly embedded 11 feet into her land. The board's representatives sat opposite them, 4 deep, in matching charcoal suits and identical expressions of strained professionalism. Brett was there, silent and unreadable. Karen was not. When the chairwoman of the zoning board called the hearing to order, Zoe took in the crowd behind them. Residents, a few press observers, scattered officials from surrounding districts, and 3 unfamiliar men in collared shirts with laminated badges. She didn't need to ask who sent them. Someone from the board had hoped a little oversight pressure might throw her off balance, but she wasn't here to be liked, and she certainly wasn't here to be afraid. Monica handled the opening argument. Calm, methodical, precise. She outlined the parcel's registered dimensions, its continuous tax payment record, and the decades of uninterrupted use. She introduced the findings from the county survey team, entered the land access preservation petition into record, and presented images of the gate installation predating the reclassification attempt. The board's attorneys countered with vague references to community access expectations, shared infrastructure evolution, and long-term development alignment. But they didn't have the maps. They didn't have the receipts. They didn't even have proper signatures from their proposed reclassification submission, just Brett's initials on an unsigned summary. When the board began questioning Zoe, their tone shifted. It was no longer legal. It was personal. One lawyer asked why she insisted on resisting integration. Another asked if she felt her independent use of the road created potential liabilities for nearby residents. Zoe didn't raise her voice. She simply opened her folder, pulled out the county's original subdivision map, and placed it flat on the table. "This is your development," she said, tapping one neatly labeled square. "This is mine. You built your gate on my road. I didn't ask you to move it. I asked you to stop pretending it wasn't mine." Silence followed. The hearing continued for over 2 hours. When it ended, the board retired for deliberation. Zoe and Monica stepped outside, the afternoon sun already burning through the lobby windows. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to argue. Now it was just about whether the system would do what it was designed to do, or bend like so many others before it. 37 minutes later, they were called back in. The zoning board issued a ruling in clear, unambiguous language. The reclassification request was rejected, the gate's placement was in violation of existing easement law, and all obstructive or misleading signage related to the property was to be removed within 10 days. The board's official reasoning cited patterned procedural manipulation and improper application of shared access doctrine. Brett stood slowly, collected his documents, and walked out without speaking. One of his associates followed, mumbling something into a phone. Zoe didn't watch them leave. She stood quietly, thanked the panel, and exited into the bright, dry air like a soldier returning from a war no one else wanted to fight. But it wasn't over. That evening, just after sunset, Zoe received a notification from her motion sensors, activity near the gate. She walked out, flashlight in hand, expecting maybe a stray animal or a nosy neighbor. What she found instead was a pile of debris left along her fence, Scrap wood, a broken lawn chair, a rusted wheelbarrow. Dumped carelessly, almost like garbage. Except there, wedged among it all, was the old gate sign. The one that had once read, HOA members only, now spray-painted with a single word, bitter. She didn't clean it up that night. She left it like a warning or a badge, because for all their suits and meetings and carefully worded policies, this was what it came down to: temper tantrums and passive aggression. And they had lost. 2 days later, the gate was taken down. A contractor arrived without fanfare and cut through the posts. Zoe watched from the top of her drive as the metal bars were loaded into the back of a utility trailer. The man driving gave her a brief nod before pulling away. No words, no confrontation, just surrender in its quietest form. Monica called that evening, barely containing her glee. "You want to file a damages claim?" she asked. "I can have it ready in 2 days." Zoe thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "Let them think they've escaped the bill. Let them sweat." Later that week, Zoe returned to work as if nothing had happened. Deliveries resumed. Trash was picked up on schedule. Contractors who had once hedged their visits now stopped by without hesitation. And the residents across the gate, those who had once signed silent approval or looked the other way, began waving again, uncertain, cautious, but no longer hostile. She didn't wave back. Zoe never expected closure to feel so quiet. There were no banners, no public apologies, no grand statements from the board admitting they'd overstepped. There was just stillness, unsettling at first, then gradually familiar, like returning to a room after a storm has passed. The drive was clear now. No concrete dividers, no signs implying restrictions that never existed. The gate, once a symbol of dominance, had been hauled away in pieces, leaving behind only the faint scars in the gravel where its base once stood. Grass was already growing in the grooves. Nature didn't wait for politics to resolve. She resumed her routines without ceremony. Deliveries came and went without interference. Utility crews responded promptly again, and even the county trash truck stopped hesitating at her boundary line. Vendors no longer called to verify her address or question her zoning status. They simply drove up, dropped off, and moved on. For the first time in months, her operations flowed without friction. She almost forgot what that kind of simplicity felt like. The board remained silent. No new proposals, no public acknowledgments. Karen, still absent from any formal correspondence, had quietly resigned from her role as community liaison, a position that had never existed in any official capacity but had been central to the campaign against Zoe. Brett was still listed on the board, though he hadn't appeared at the last 3 meetings according to neighborhood chatter. A slow collapse had begun, not in any explosive fashion, but in the brittle, inevitable way brittle institutions dissolve once exposed. Residents started asking more questions about dues, about budgeting, about how much money had been spent fighting an imaginary land war. Zoe didn't insert herself into those discussions. She had no interest in reforming the board. She didn't want to sit on committees or suggest new bylaws. All she wanted was what she had before they tried to take it: space, autonomy, and peace. But there were reminders, small ones, that the conflict had left its mark. She noticed them in the way people hesitated when they saw her in town, especially those who had once kept their heads down during the worst of the escalation. They weren't hostile, just cautious, unsure whether to pretend nothing had happened or offer a smile as if trying to earn one back. She never made it easy for them. She didn't pretend to forget, but neither did she throw the past in their faces. She simply carried herself the same way she always had, with quiet certainty, unshaken by their discomfort. One afternoon, while checking the wiring in her storage shed, she found the bent metal placard that had once hung crookedly on the gatepost, the one declaring "Private Entry, Authorized Residents Only." It had rusted at the corners, warped by time and weather. She stared at it for a while, then leaned it against the outer fence, right at the edge of her property, facing inward. Not as a warning to others, but as a reminder to herself of how quickly assumed authority can turn into weaponized bureaucracy. That fall, she built a new sign at the entrance to her drive. Nothing grand, just a slab of reclaimed wood, treated and sanded, with the words hand-burned into the surface. Private road. Respect boundaries. She mounted it high enough that no one could mistake its meaning, but not so imposing as to provoke more attention. The necessary. It wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about clarity. And then life moved on. Her business grew. She took on a second apprentice, a sharp kid with welding talent and a quiet edge that reminded her of herself. Orders increased, partly out of local loyalty, partly because people started associating her name with a kind of unshakable integrity. Her story had spread further than she liked. Articles appeared in industry newsletters, online blogs picked up threads, and more than one stranger showed up asking for advice on property disputes. She never turned them away, but she never indulged them either. She wasn't a folk hero. She was a woman who knew what belonged to her and refused to let it be taken. Months passed. The new board formed quietly, more restrained this time, more transparent if only out of caution. They never approached her again. Maybe they understood now that some lines can't be moved by consensus or pressure or politeness masked as policy. Maybe they just didn't want another fight. Either way, they stayed on their side of the boundary, and Zoe stayed on hers. That was enough.